today we're interviewing a very interesting and special person in the topic of invasive species, Aaron Martin. Could you please tell us just a little about your job and how you came to focus specifically on invasive species? What drew you to that?
I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our national wildlife refuge system, and our national wildlife refuge system is comprised of 573 conservation units across the country, ranging from Maine all the way down to Guam and the South Pacific and the Caribbean islands, and a lot of terrestrial and island habitat mixed in all of that um, to help achieve our goal of conserving and protecting wildlife and the lands that they live on, and the supporting the people that rely on those resources for hunting or recreation or subsistence purposes. The Fish and Wildlife Service works with a host of different partners to help manage invasive species, which are considered the second greatest threat to native species resiliency and behind habitat loss globally. And so the National Wildlife Refuge System and the Fish and Wildlife Service has this invasive species program. And I get to be a part of helping support our biologists and our refuge managers and our partners across the country to do that. I kind of came about this position in a roundabout way. As I was telling Anna at the beginning, I grew up in Idaho and grew up on a small farm outside of Boise, Idaho. I went to the University of Montana for an undergraduate degree in wildlife and fisheries biology, and then started working as a seasonal technician for the U.S. Forest Service and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and different state agencies, and kind of fell in love with Alaska throughout that process as I worked up here as a seasonal employee. Started working with the Fish and Wildlife Service permanently in 2010, and in 2015, I became the Alaska Regional Invasive Species Program Coordinator, tied to some of the other duties I had, and just really loved getting to participate in on-the-ground conservation and restoration of degraded habitats in Alaska. Like you were saying, Anna, it's exciting to be here with you because we're on the other end of the conservation spectrum or the invasion curve from a lot of places in the United States, where Alaska is largely considered uninfested with invasive species comparatively. There are certainly problems, invasive plants and animals here, but not to the degree that you have in your backyard, perhaps. So it's been it was really cool being a part of that, but then getting to start to see what was happening across the country and all the amazing places that the Fish and Wildlife Service gets to help steward with our local communities and tribes and territories. And so a few years ago, I became our National Invasive Species Program Coordinator. My portfolio gets to be a part of all these amazing stories, ranging from managing brown tree snakes in the South Pacific and Guam and Northern Marianas Islands to rats in the Caribbean and Alaska, and terrestrial invasive annual grasses in the Rockies and the upper Midwest, and a little bit of everything in between. So it's super exciting, and really it's the people that I get to work with, and it's like the perfect opportunity to be a true ecologist instead of an expert of one thing. That's always been really fascinating for me.
So you said that the invasive species are a big threat to native species. I would like you to clarify what even counts as invasive species, and why exactly they are such a big threat.
Invasive species globally are considered the second greatest threat to native species and extinction. And the Department of Interior, who the Fish and Wildlife Service is a part of, we define invasive species as a non-native or alien species whose introduction causes is likely to cause a economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So these species become problematic because they often outcompete these native species, disrupt ecosystem functions, and can cause significant damage to agriculture, infrastructure, cultural resources. And I think a really important thing to talk about right now is how it impacts military readiness and the security of our borders and our country. So a really great example of um, an invasive species, I think close to home for you, is nutria in the Chesapeake Bay area. Nutria are a large semi-aquatic rodent. I don't know if you guys have seen Princess Bride and the rodents of unusual size, but they aren't quite that big, but they're large rats looking animal, and they're from South America and were introduced in the US for the fur trade. And they've expanded through southeastern US and parts of California, and they were established in the Chesapeake Bay area. So that Chesapeake Bay area has a lot of really important coastal marshes that help protect the communities and the ecosystems from hurricanes and flooding. And the nutria feed on aquatic vegetation and riparian plants, and that really increases erosion rates and degraded habitat property values and things like that. So were able to work, Fish and Wildlife Service working with states and local county governments were able to do a lot of intensive eradication while doing marsh restoration, where you plant native plants back in there to help kind of reestablish that native ecosystem. So
So since we're talking about like, kind of like getting rid of the invasive species, we were also wondering if you thought that like um, killing them would be the best way to get rid of them, or if there are like other alternatives that you guys also look into.
that's a great question. The service gets a lot of questions around our trapping practices on federal land and state. This applies to a lot of state agencies as well. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Interior work to use what's called the integrated pest management system, where you use kind of the most environmentally friendly, least lethal techniques first, and then you go through kind of adaptive management where you try that and you learn and modify your process. And so so the answer to your question is it's a complex issue, whether we kill animals or move them. So it's rooted in ecological roles, legal protections, and a lot of cultural values in that area. So it's often a case by case basis, because some native plants and animals, some invasive plants and animals can become seen as a benefit to the local community, and so it's a fine line to work with our local
Can you give us
communities.
an example of this?
Yeah. Um, so their invasive species are often protected or are often not protected by any law. There's actually laws and executive orders from previous presidents where we say we will go and eradicate or control to the maximum extent invasive plants and animals to protect cultural values, ecosystems. There's invasive fish that have been introduced to the United States, some intentionally, some unintentionally, and like northern snakehead is a good example near you, but also northern pike, which are native to parts of Alaska, have been introduced to other parts of Alaska. Those fish are extremely invasive, considered on the high end of invasiveness because of how much negative impact they can have on the local ecosystems, because those species, those native fish and animals didn't evolve with that type of a predator. The other end of the spectrum that I think you're thinking about or searching for is the recreational fisherman that loves to go out and fish. I love to fish. I have 20 different fishing rods and several different boats, and I love to fish. But I realize there's certain species that shouldn't be here, and it's causing really bad problems for the fish that I really care about. My family and my friends rely on salmon for our freezers to eat throughout the year. Northern pike that have been introduced into South Central Alaska feed on native trout and salmon and have caused massive declines in those native populations. So the other side of the equation, though, is there's a neighbor that could really love to fish for northern pike because they are such aggressive feeders, and that's an economic boost for a local community where they have been introduced. So it's a really delicate balance when we think about how to proceed with managing invasive species like that, because it's a delicate balance on how we manage, but also how we talk about them, because we don't necessarily want to incentivize the harvest of them, because then it becomes a desirable species, even though it's really degrading the local ecosystem and other things that people rely on.
Yeah, like how you mentioned with the snakeheads, I know in Florida, uh, they kind of shoot the iguanas from the trees, or I know the lanternflies is a big problem in Virginia during like spring, summertime. And then there was like a TikTok trend where you like squish the bugs to see how many you could get. But
Yeah.
then if we see those invasive species compared to honeybees, they're also considered invasive ones. How come, it's acceptable to kill one species, but another is more protected?
Some of our native species are protected by federal laws and state laws, right? And so we are instructed, and we don't want to harvest those or reduce those, because we want to make sure that they are here into the future. And us as a community, as a global community, have decided to put more value into that species versus another. And I think it's that cost benefit analysis of, do we want to adopt this species as being something that is beneficial to the maximum extent to the community? And it really goes back. I hope you keep going back to that definition that I shared. It's like, it's of an invasive species. It's something that was introduced that causes economic or human health problems, environmental harm, or human harm. So there's native species, and I think this gets back to one of the questions maybe Ruby or Anna was asking. There are native species that have benefited from humans becoming more present on the landscape, and so those species become more abundant. Certainly, there's native bird species that are way more abundant, and some people may call them invasive species, but they're more that they, in my mind, in my philosophical view, they are more of a nuisance, or what's called a pest species. And a pest species can be a native or non-native species that causes problems, but not nearly to the extent. But they're not something that was introduced intentionally or unintentionally. And something for you guys to think about in your course. So it's really intriguing. I would love to hear back from you now or later, is the concept of range expansion that's happening as temperatures warm over winters. Species are being able to move further north and west, and you have invasive species and native species to the U.S. Southeast that have never been out of Florida, right? And now they're creeping more northward. You have species that have never crept out of like the northern part of the United States, and now they're creeping well into Canada, and some of them are reaching Alaska for the first time. So that's something we as professionals still talk about, like where is this nuance between native range expansion and invasive species? And I keep going back to myself, like native range expansion is we did not introduce, as humans, we did not introduce that species. Unfortunately, we have influenced the environment on a global scale, I believe, and it makes that habitat more available.
Has your work ever made you question what's more morally right or wrong when you have to remove one species to protect an ecosystem?
Yeah, these conversations that we were just mentioning and sharing are complex decisions, and a lot goes into making them. As a program coordinator, I have had to weigh the value of individual animal lives against the survival of entire ecosystems or species, right? And so it's my job working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to protect native species and their habitats. And so I go back to that when I have a conflict of the humane side of me wants to like not necessarily unduly harm animals or plants. But the core part of our mission is conservation of native plants and animals and their habitats. So it's never an easy decision. And we work really closely with biologists and partners and community leaders to ensure our actions are as science-based as possible, transparent, and humane as possible. One example of that is I'm going to go back to Alaska, is invasive fox that were introduced into the Aleutian Islands. So as Alaska was colonized by Eastern Europeans and Russians coming over, a lot of those islands were colonized and introduced. Fox of various kinds were introduced to these islands for bearing, so people could have another opportunity, because these islands were, there was no native predators there. They're just amazing seabird colonies and nesting songbird habitat, and those introductions led to massive destruction of these native seabird and songbird colonies on these islands, and made them more or less like denuded landscapes as far as native wildlife. And these fox didn't have anything to do with getting there. They didn't ask to be put there, and they were just doing what fox do, and survive and eat things that are available to them. And they're beautiful critters, and they certainly deserve to have a place on this world, but they were decimating the native ecosystems there. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, working with the Nature Conservancy and Island Conservation and the USDA Animal Plant Services, did several, like decades worth of eradication efforts on these islands, to eradicate Arctic and the red foxes from these islands. And it's led to like incredible recovery of these islands for the seabirds that migrate to South America and Southeast Asia, and the native songbirds have recolonized and are still recolonizing. And then also like just the vegetation is recolonizing and reestablishing itself. So it's hard to watch the destruction of one thing, the destruction of a native ecosystem, and it's hard to watch the destruction of or displacement of a native or a non-native animal. But it's also really rewarding philosophically and conservation-wise to see an ecosystem get to be back to what it was before we really messed it up. And
I think those answers were very comprehensive, and honestly, I learned a lot of things from just this 15-minute conversation.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. I hope all of you have a great rest of the week, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and learn a little bit from you guys too.
And
Enjoy
have a
the
great
holiday.
Thanksgiving.